We're fortunate today to have Dr. Brian Sims from the National Association of State Mental Health Program Directors. Did I get that right, Dr. Sims?
You did, sir.
All right. So he's the medical advisor for that organization, and so he's going to talk to us today just about trauma-informed care, working with the kids, working with young adults, even in that. So I think we're in for a treat today. So Dr. Sims, if you want to go ahead and turn on your video, and I will mute myself and stop talking, and the show is all yours. Thanks for being here today.
Righty. Oh, no. Thank you all, first and foremost. It is such an honor, number one, to be a part of this, but also to look at the number of participants when we're considering the era that we're in right now, where virtual communication seems to be our mainstay. It's just a wonderful opportunity to be able to talk to so many people. And I want to give thanks to Bradley and to Beth and the others for this gracious invitation, because it gives me a chance to talk about passion. And really, this is my passion. This is something we've been doing now for the better part of 20 to 22 years, working with the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care. And I've had the pleasure, really, and I have to give you guys some kudos, you do some rocket work there in Ohio. It is fantastic, the things that are coming out in Missouri and with other states that are really getting it as far as what is needed by the populations. You guys are now taking a look at a critical step as I see it, because it's one that's not being explored in depth enough. While we're unsure about where all of this is going and how it's going to emerge, we do know that at some point in time, we're going to reintegrate with those people that we serve. So I thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking about how those interactions might be assisted. Now, please don't take this presentation as any point of a lecture of any sort. This is more or less, hopefully, something to offer each and every one of you some additional tools for your already well-established toolbox. Now, Bradley, I'm going to admit right off the bat that my signal also wavers. So please let me know if I come in or go out. We're having a rainstorm here in Maryland, and the weather affects our website and our Wi-Fi connection. So anyway.
So far, so good.
All righty, wonderful. Well, then let's move ahead and take a look at what we'll be talking about. With each one of us now facing going into our settings at some point in time and beginning to talk to the people that we serve, in this children, the young adults, the adolescents, we need to start looking at two sides of the coin, if you want to look at it that way. One is, how do we interact with them, understanding the unique challenges that each one of them has most likely encountered, but also how do we balance that with how we ourselves have been affected by this COVID issue. Some of us have been affected very personally, some have been affected less personally, but we will take that into the setting. So the first thing that I really want to point out to everyone is it's all going to be about connection. Connection is going to be one of the greatest things that you bring to the table when you start to connect. What I'm going to do is kind of make a reference not only to talking with kids for the first time, but back it up and also talk from the level of parents and from the level of those who have been locked in with their kids over this entire time frame, what also can be helpful tools for you. But first, I want to review, and hopefully not to a boredom sense, but just to go over the definition of trauma, because I think in the COVID era that we're living in right now, this definition becomes much more clear in terms of its understanding globally of what it is. First of all, it talks about individual trauma, and this is something that we're all going to see because the kids are going to present to us in very much different ways, because each one of them has had a different experience outside of the setting, and they will be bringing that into the setting when you begin to talk to them. So it's an individual trauma, and it may result from either a singular event, some have seen things, heard things, or personally experienced things, or it might be a series of events. or circumstances that have happened in this child's life, but it is how they experience it that determines to them whether it's going to be traumatic or not. Now, all of you have heard this definition, I'm sure, with any discussion of trauma-informed care, but I think it's relevant because it tells us that as we see the kids that we're serving, we're not quite sure on the surface how to read what may be going on in those kids. That experience will determine its severity, but also we know that there are going to be long-lasting adverse effects. And these effects in these kids are going to be longer term. They're going to affect how the child thinks, how the child reacts, how they are physically, socially, emotionally. And again, we always want to keep this piece in how they are even spiritually. When we're looking at this new world that we're living in already, we're looking at parents taking on a role that maybe they weren't too accustomed to. Maybe they were thrust into a position where they are now at home with the kids and figuring out ways to balance things for them. And we also keep in mind that many homes are not your typical mother, father, happy home. Everyone sits around and they play games all day and they're very supportive. There are some homes that the children were actually doing better being in the school setting than they were at home. So now that they're thrust in that position, you're talking about a lot of additional traumas that some of these kids may have experienced. Now, in that, I showed you the 3 E's. And those 3 E's, the first E was about events. And these are the things that cause the trauma. And these are highlights to look out for as we go through. The second E was about experience, to remind us again that not every child is going to respond to their circumstances in exactly the same way. Some will be much more traumatized by events that have occurred than others, and there's a whole plethora of reasons why that would be. And thirdly is the effects of trauma, which has the long-lasting effects that we may see in its initial stages, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. Now, one thing I do want to carry to the table, above the ability to connect, I do want to reference the connection again to say that how you react to that child or to that adolescent or to that young adult on the first meeting that you have is probably the most critical thing, because you're going to be able to establish connection based on what we don't do more so than what we do. First and foremost is, again, how we initially present. Do we present as, okay, what you in here for? What's wrong with you? Or do we actually start talking to them as to what happened? Tell us what happened. And also understanding in the second column you see there is that a lot of the presentations that they are actually showing you may be adaptations to how they've been getting along through this whole COVID experience. That many of them have been forced to stay indoors, and if indoors wasn't a really nice place to be, how they felt and coped with it, and the fact that thirdly, they may not be in a position to trust you to share all of those information. So there'll be a lot of blocking and sometimes some symptoms that would be, for most of us, not a wonderful thing to have to contend with. But thirdly, we look at the fact that in the relationships that have established, we know that there's healing. And you're going to hear this over and over again in the presentation, that what we should be bringing to the table, both at home as well as our first interactions with them, is that there is hope. There is going to move in a positive direction. And you're going to do it as a team, as opposed to saying to them, things will be better, just watch, see what happens. You want to work this with them, understanding that it's not always going to be sunny and you're not going to paint the picture that way. So in that, we're looking at a couple of things. Number one, and this is a hard one for us, all behaviors that you see have meaning to them. And it's important that we know that, because sometimes we dismiss it. As soon as we see adverse types of behaviors on the part of the child, we sometimes label that as, okay, that's just that child. But we need to add more to that to say that there's a reason behind that. So in addition to the symptoms as adaptations, it's also about how we approach things. Are we doing it with the lens of control, or are we doing it with the lens of comfort? And you'll know very readily by the response that you get where that is coming from, because a lot of times we present in controlling ways. And the controlling ways are, we have 15 minutes, this is what we need to get done, this is how it's going to be done. And you find that you've already lost the child by that point in time. You will be labeled as a person that is just like all the 500 other people that they've ever had dealings with. So what you want to do is make sure that you set your goal in the beginning. What do you want out of that? You're obviously not going to establish this wonderful connection right from the beginning, and the person's going to trust you, and you're going to go down the flowery road together, and you're all going to be doing this. But you need to look at the fact that you're going to build on not their deficits, but build on their successes. Build on things that they were able to do, and sometimes they'll share with you, this is how I cope with working from this point to this point. And not to squash it, but to say, I hear you. And be able to say, wow, that must have been something. Use that empathy. Use that empathic component that says, I understand. It doesn't necessarily mean that you always agree with how they chose to do it. Because some would say, you know what, I stayed in my room and I smoked joints for the entire time the COVID crisis was here. Okay, I hear you. I understand that must have been a difficult thing for you to be able to cope with that, but not to squash it and tell them that, oh, that was the most horrible thing you could have possibly done, because you're looking and seeking for that connection. Now, this slide here, I would imagine is probably the most important slide that we're going to carry out of this whole discussion. And the reason why I put it in there is I want you to see that this is a slide that was developed way before COVID became any form of reality for any of us. But if you look in what could potentially be traumatic events, you'll see in every category, from abuse to loss to chronic stressors, what you see in there are COVID interweavings, if you would have it, in the response patterns that we call trauma. Think about emotional abuse. The fact that if there were emotional abuse taking place within the home, and now the child is in the home and they're there all the time, that there's different degrees and volumes and increase of the emotional abuse elements. Sexual and physical are they're givens, that if that exists within the home and the child cannot escape from the home, that could be increasing traumatic component. The witnessing things or the domestic violence are all a part of that component. Now let's move over to the loss, because many of these kids, you may not know, have had relatives who have succumbed to the COVID virus, or may have direct people within the household who either have had it or are in isolation at that point in time, taking all of those into consideration. And then into the chronic stressors, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, because we also need to take a look at how communities respond to the COVID, and how these kids within the communities are subsequently carrying away how the community responds. Now, this is under a lens of things like poverty. When you look at a poverty, a neighborhood that is poverty-stricken, there is a completely different lens in terms of how it's viewed, how COVID is viewed, how the social distancing becomes something much more difficult when you're talking a large number of people in a confined space pattern. That as much as we say 6 feet, for some communities, it's extremely difficult within your apartment buildings or otherwise to do so. But also look at the historical trauma, because many communities feel ostracized and left out. And while we're dealing with COVID and sending testing around and dealing with all of this, there are many communities that feel that they've been left out. And this is the message that gets incorporated into the children, because they then see that the parents are hopeless or feeling helpless, and they carry that piece into where they are. So when we're talking to the kids, one of the things we want to do is try to lower our questions so that they're more open-ended and less tension-inducing. So when you see that child for the first time and the behaviors are not what you would want them to be, we focus more on trying to understand it, and understand it as a person, not understand them as a problem. Because I know in mental health field, quite often we will label people, whether children or adults. There's my ADHD. There's my antisocial person. There's my child that has specific emotional, inabilities and difficulties. And instead, we start to look at there's Frederick, there's Jonathan, there's Janice. These are people that I work with directly. And how do I better understand Janice? How do I better understand Jonathan? You see the difference here? So in that, all of these is because the kids are going to be bringing all sorts of things to your table. You're going to hear about fears. You're going to hear about anxieties. You're going to hear about their grief. You're going to hear about their guilt. But a lot of times that is only if if you are able to open the door to allow them to talk about those things. Because of their adjustments, quite often they may come in, and if you ask them, hey, how are you feeling? How'd you make it through this COVID? The answer you're likely to get is, oh, I'm fine. Everything's good. I'm okay. Because what you've done is you've given them a question that's very easy for them to answer, but you haven't connected. So I would just keep those things in mind. Now, as we move into this, I also want you to see how many different areas of the child can be affected. Because additionally, with the external things that are happening with that child, there are also internal things that are going on. If you look at the second paragraph, it talks about just in child development. And I know you wanted just a little taste of the neurobiological or brain association. And this is a good beginning for it, because in it talks about exposure, and exposure not necessarily to just violence, but exposure to adverse events occurring in a child's life can deprive that child as much as 10% of their potential IQ. And that opens the door to them being very vulnerable to all sorts of additional things that we label later as emotional disturbances, learning problems, behavior problems, by the time they get back to you, but also even if they're already in that school age grouping. It doesn't mean that this process stops, because as we'll see, the brain of a child really continues to develop well into their adolescence. And as we are all aware, adolescence can go as high as 22 to 23 years old. Now, let's talk about the brain, because in it, I really want you to see that the brain is the center of all of this. But I want you to focus more on the last comment there. For each of us, our brain's functioning is a reflection of what? Our experiences. Because each one of us has had a set of experiences, and those experiences determine how we're handling things. But it differs with regards to children and adults. And this is from the work of Bruce Perry, who is a child psychiatrist and does a lot of work with trauma in children. And in brain development, what Bruce Perry says is that the infant brain in its development is really a co-constructed component. And what that means is that that child's brain is wholly dependent in its development on the stimulus it receives and the caretaker's input. So it's a co-constructed thing. So whether that caretaker is a parent or someone who is watching the child or someone who, even in foster care, has the occasional connection with that child, that brain is developing based on two sets of information. And why that's important to understand is really taking a look at this one, because it's how the child experiences things that is going to make a difference in what happens in that child's brain. Because the way that kids have experiences are different than the way that adults have experiences. If an adult has an experience, it's pretty clear cut what happens to us. Our brains change. And we use the example that if something terrorizing happens to us, we are at a capacity of our brain's maturity where we learn from that process. We either learn not to go back in that area where that traumatizing component took place. We don't talk to the people that threatened us. We don't go into wherever. And what I want you to see here is that what Dr. Perry is talking about is that kids, depending on their developmental milestones, don't have that backup plan. They don't have that ability to be able to measure things. So for us, it changes our brain in terms of having experiences. But for kids, it organizes their brain. Now, what's the difference in terms of the term organizing is that organizing means that that child begins to mold their overall behaviors based on the environment input that they're receiving. Now, we use a different example. If the child is in a household, and in that household are people that are constantly fighting and cursing and negative behaviors and neglectful and abusive, that child begins to see that in its organizational component as its world. And that can transcend into what you see coming out into your various interactions with others. The other thing that our kids are battling with, and depending on their age at greater degrees, are hormonal variations. So not only are they dealing with the trauma that is causing excessive anxiety, they're also dealing with high levels of hormones that are affecting their body 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, 365 days per year. When we understand that, we also understand that there's going to be those behavioral variances. There's going to be that reticence. There is going to be that hyperarousal where the child becomes someone that doesn't fit our schedule. And we use that example because when we look at things like the cortisol levels in kids and how it goes throughout the day, it helps us to understand better that we're not going to put them into our adult realm. Now, if any of you have adolescents at home, I would only challenge you to ask you the question that if you were to say to your adolescent at 8 o'clock at night, okay, it's 8 o'clock, it's time for you to go to bed. Why? Because at my age, I tell you, 8 o'clock, I'm already asleep an hour and a half. But if you said that to an adolescent, what do you think their likely response would be? And the response not only would be negative, but it's reflective of the fact that we're not understanding that their peaks are different than our peaks. So at that point, when we're saying we are ready to lie down, their hormone levels are at their beginning to start their peak upward. So these things are also helpful in seeing so that we don't ostracize or go after the individual negatively. Now let's move to, again, what trauma deals with in the brain. It affects a number of areas in the brain, but I've honed it down to really only talk about 3 out of 4 of these. I want to talk about the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. Why? Because the amygdala, people are pretty familiar with the amygdala. It's all about fight, flight, or freeze. It is our body's way of protecting us. Whenever there is something that is of a threat to any of us, our amygdala is going to give us one of those 3 responses, and it can vary from circumstance to circumstance. You'll see some people in the midst of a crisis, they will actually move towards the crisis. There will be others that will run away from the crisis. And there will be yet others that may freeze in place and not move. And depending on the circumstances, you'll see any of those 3. The hippocampus is important in this because trauma affects it, and I'll show you on the next slide what happens there, but that hippocampus is all about our ability to store our most recent conscious memories. Now, I'll give you a little something that's being researched right now, and that is that there are researchers out of Hopkins that are taking a look at the possible connections between our hippocampal's effect from the brain and actual declarations of hallucinations. That a lot of times what we sometimes label as hallucinations may actually be repressed memories or the hippocampal dysfunction based on trauma experiences. Lastly, it's the prefrontal cortex, and I raise this one because it is the last portion of the brain that develops, but it is the one that has the highest degree of association, because within the prefrontal cortex, this is where kids are now making identities and pooling their information and making associations, and they're being able now to pool all of their things together and come up with a logical response. So their cognitive and emotional responses are built on having this area of the brain as intact as possible. It is the last to develop, and when you look at infants, it can take upwards of 4 years, the first 4 years of that infant's life, for that prefrontal cortex to begin to get to its level, but its full maturity is not often seen until many years later. Now, when you take a look at what happens with trauma, what we notice is that the amygdala, number one, changes. And the way it changes is that the signal that hits the amygdala to tell a person that they're in danger is heightened significantly. So instead of fight, flight, or freeze, for many of them, it is life-threatening flight, life-threatening fight, life-threatening freeze. And this is seen quite often in that whatever the stimulus may be, causes that person to make us say something like, wow, all I did was close the door, and they really freaked out. I don't understand what took place. The amygdala is on hyperdrive because of the trauma. And this is one behavior you'll see. That prefrontal cortex that I talked about, hugely, hugely important, because this is your association. This connects things. This helps people to be able to put all of their data together and come up with a reasonable outline of what they should be doing next. What has been noticed in multiple studies is that the prefrontal cortex volume actually diminishes in individuals with trauma. Now, this sounds like old people, and you're seeing a slide that it talks about PTSD, but we're really talking about the reality, which is in our neighborhoods, in our communities, our kids have PTSD. So we don't want to play that like it's only a soldier disease. So the same brain changes that are happening in the soldiers, you'll see in a second, are actually happening in kids. Lastly, the hippocampus, which is all about that memory retention, also shows a volume loss. So you're talking about some pretty significant changes that can account for some of the behaviors that we're likely to see as these kids are returning from significantly negative stimuli that is going on. Here's one example of what can happen, because these are the brains of actually two 11-year-old boys. The one on the left is really the normal brain. And you can see its topography. You can see that the difference between that brain and the brain on the right seems to focus more on that white band that surrounds the brain. Well, I want to point out that on MRIs, CAT scans, X-rays, etc., whenever there is nothing there, it lights up bright white like that. So what is that telling you about the brain on the right? It is suggesting that that brain on the right actually is smaller. And that is documented. The prefrontal cortex, which is the outer covering of that brain, has actually lost some of its volume. Now, I have some good news to share in all of this before I go any further, is that the three things I'm talking about, research has indicated that with implementation of trauma-informed strategies that you guys do so beautifully, actually can cause reversal in the processes I've already addressed. So that's a good thing to say at this point. I do want to show you that it does not bear any semblance of age on this. It does not care how old you are in terms of the types of stressors and traumas that are experienced. You imagine a 3-year-old who is being neglected, and we dismiss it quite often as they're too young to understand. We also need to understand that there are significant organic changes that are occurring as a result of that neglect. Not only are we talking IQ changes, but we're also talking about, again, the prefrontal cortex shrinkage. We're also talking about the hippocampal elements. And on this slide, something that they're still studying, the center blackened areas, the two areas that you see, you notice on the extreme neglect show to be much larger. Those are the ventricles of the brain. And they're not quite sure what the relevance of that is, but it is noted in post-traumatic stress disorders and as well in these children. This last slide really deals with what's called a PET scanner. And many of you are familiar with PET scanning, that you can attach electrodes, ask people to do things or have experiences, and watch to see what areas of the brain light up. So on this slide here, these are actually adults, and these are the brains of 4 soldiers. Now, I'm bringing this up because of what it's going to show you in just a moment. But if you focus on this and look at the top right, top left, and bottom left, what you will see in those slides is that each one of those individuals were given some sort of traumatic stimulus of some form or fashion. The only one that was not given a stimulus was the one on the bottom right. So what we want to see is actually 2 things that come out of this slide. The first is the area of the brain that you would have expected to light up in terms of trauma does exactly that, and that's the amygdala. So if you notice on the top right, top left, and bottom left, the amygdala fires every time. And that is consistent with a traumatic experience. But if you notice the one that had no trauma introduced, the amygdala is silent. And that makes sense. But the other piece I want you to see is on the 3 that were traumatized, an area of the brain did not light up, that only lit up during no trauma. And that's the area you see in the bottom right called Broca's area. And if you're familiar with Broca's area, it is the area of the brain that is centered around language and speech. And this helps us to understand that in times of trauma, the brain makes a selection of what's important to do at that point and not. And this is where you get some people that are referred to as scared speechless. That part of the brain actually shuts down. And many times in our interactions with kids, you can gauge the level of trauma that that child has experienced just based on their inability to give you any response back whatsoever. But again, I want to say to you that wonderful changes have taken place when we start to really do our trauma-informed connections. This slide here is just an indication of what happens when trauma is introduced to an otherwise traumatized individual. It's the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala that end up getting fired. And when they get fired, the child, quote unquote, flips their lid. The top portion of the slide really shows the hand, it's a clenched hand with the amygdala being the thumb area, but the fingers are the prefrontal cortex. What happens when they get triggered by whatever traumatic event it happens, the prefrontal cortex essentially flips. And you start to see huge emotions, anger, fear, all of those things begin to come out. So it helps us better understand that. So our job really, even at home, is to try to help our kids with self-regulation. How do we work with them on that? We need to work with them so that they not to keep that nervous system aroused, but to also work on practicing it, because sometimes what we do is we try our methods, as creative as we may be, but we try them only one time. And if it doesn't work, then we say the whole process is over. When an understanding that not only does it take practice, but it takes looking at 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 different options and try each one, because every child's not going to respond to the same ones that you have. Now, we also need to look at our own systems, because as these kids are coming back into our systems, are our systems even prepared to receive them? And how do we know that? We take a look at whether or not our systems themselves are trauma informed. Does our system that is receiving the kids back into the system, do they recognize that this trauma has occurred? But more importantly, do they understand that there's recovery? Do they believe in it? And when I travel the country, I often ask groups, do you believe in the people that you serve? And majority of the time, everyone just yells, yes, I do, I believe in them. So I said, how do you show that? How do you let them know that you believe in serving them? And most of the time it comes out in, I believe that there is hope. I believe that there's recovery. I believe that that person can heal. And that's what you need to do. You also need to recognize that the signs and symptoms of trauma isn't just unipolar. It's not in the people we just serve by themselves. It's also in us. And it can affect us. And if it affects us, it also affects our colleagues, and it affects the people that we serve. And then we need to understand about responding, about policies, procedures, practices, making sure that we're on board with that. But the most important piece is practicing resisting re-traumatization. And that's a hard one. It's really a hard one, because many of us get into the premise of saying, oh, I know exactly how you feel. Or even worse, that little thing that you're experiencing is nothing in comparison to what could have happened. So we minimize it. But in either way, it is anti-connection, and you lose them very quickly. So these next set of slides are really more so some givens for you. Not exactly anything that's earth-shattering or anything that you don't already know, but just to give you some tools. Now, say you are a parent. These slides are particularly nice for parents. First of all, if your child is at home and they're ready to integrate or otherwise, be a role model. Because understand, from everything we talked about before, they're going to follow you. So if you are out there saying to them, COVID doesn't exist, it was a big plot that was brought up to try to bring whoever down, we need to understand that our kids are going to buy that. They're going to build into it. But you also want to be aware about how you talk about COVID. Because if you're constantly talking to your kids about the devastations, oh, 40 more people died, whatever, what message are we giving our kids? We're not really painting it as a safe picture or even potentially safe. but we also listen to them as well. Because your goal as a parent, your goal as a caretaker, is to keep that child safe. We want to explain about social distancing. The CDC puts out regular daily events, and if you've been following the CDC guidelines, one of the things that they're really talking about with COVID now is that a majority of the cases of COVID are coming from violations of social distancing. That very few are coming from touching objects or being exposed to surfaces that they touch. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but a majority are coming from the violations of the social distancing. So we as responsible individuals need to really relate that message to everyone, not only to our friends and neighbors, but also to the kids that we're trying to do so. There are other techniques that you can see here that really just kind of focus on working on positive aspects. Mirror their feelings. Get in and do some deep breathing with them, but focus on the positive. And what you want to do is establish and maintain some routines. What are you doing? What's your schedule? What things do you do for yourself to keep calm? Because it gives them at least some marching orders that are personable. These are things I can do that help me. And then help them by identifying some additional things that they might not be thinking about. How about writing a letter to grandma? You haven't seen grandma in quite a while. Why don't you write a letter to her? You know, sending positive messages, not messages, but positive messages over social media, because this is their world. So we try to find a way to integrate ourselves into that world rather than say, like me, I don't do Facebook. You know, that doesn't help in their world when they are wholly wrapped up within it. Also, depending on the age, keep your discussions age appropriate. If you're going to talk to elementary school kids, brief information, but also positive outcomes. We're doing all of this so that you don't get sick. But keep the primary premise: wash your hands, staying away, keeping the social distancing. As they become older, you can add more things because they'll be a little more vocal about safety issues. And they may need you to be able to separate what has been fantasized and what is really real. You know, I heard that if you bathe in bleach, that really helps COVID. And you need to be there to explain that there is evidence to show that it does not do so. As you get to the high school, upper middle schools, you can go at length. Give them factual information, refer them even to the CDC. Give them guidelines so that above all, what you're doing is not teaching or talking at them. You're actually talking to them and listening for what they have to say. When you see the kids, what are some signs that they might be troubled? And these are things, again, I know you know this already. These are things that already are in your repertoire. But if you're looking at preschoolers, these are some of the things you can look at. You're going with elementary school children: irritability, aggressiveness, clinginess, nightmares, all of those things. Now understand what was pre-morbid as well might have some effect with regards to their process as well. If the child had social or school phobias prior to coming in, you can only imagine that that might create a whole new scenario in terms of their willingness to return. Now, it's important to keep trauma-informed perspectives in mind, folks. And when I say trauma-informed perspective, SAMHSA has come up with a number of principles in terms of practicing trauma-informed elements. But one of the things that becomes very clear is to try to support helping people to regulate when they're having trouble. How to help people, these kids, to set time out for themselves that actually helps them to further ground, to allay their anxiety. But also mirror it. Don't just give it, mirror it. Prioritize your relationships. Look at how the social supports. Look at how, if you're connecting with them, their connection can be to others as well. And how do you support each other? Look, I know I can't come home with you or whatever. I really appreciate you sharing this information with me. How could we maybe communicate so that I can keep up with what's happening with you? Be transparent. Explain why in your decisions, but understand that your decisions are a collective team effort. This is not, here are the things you need to do, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It is, what do you think about us working together on these issues? That way you can share with me if there's difficulties, other than saying, I can't do this and I'm going to toss the whole thing out. Looking internally, look at your own staff, look at the people you're working around, and try to help them to come on board as well. Because as you all know, if you are working in a setting where you have the client as your person, you have the child as your individual that you're working with, the folks around you can make or break that as well. How your receptionist responds, how the people around them will respond, who then talks to them when you're not talking to them, all need to be on the same page. That if you're painting a picture of positivity, you want to make sure that your staff around you are of the same belief, because otherwise it can undo very quickly all the hard work that you all are doing. Remember also to reframe the behaviors. It's important to remember that during these times of COVID and any stressful situation, the types of behaviors they tend to show us can be stressful to us. Okay? So they're going to be showing up not in their best. And we need to realize that that is an adjustment that they are trying to get through, instead of they're doing this just to piss me off. We need to give everyone that grace period. And also the understanding, I can see that this is really causing you a lot of stress. So what are we saying? We need to work on our patience, our understanding, give them the benefit of the doubt. And that's tough. It's tough, but it's necessary. How about our own environment? I travel the country quite often taking a look at people's physical environments, because everything is really built on that. Because how your environment looks can reduce the anxiety almost immediately that they see. And I use as an example, like emergency rooms. I'll go into many emergency rooms, and believe me, the things that you see in the emergency room would make you sicker. Because quite often what's in the emergency room are a whole host of ill individuals. And then in some emergency rooms, thankfully they're reducing significantly in numbers. They would even put up signs all around the emergency room that say, here's a sign that you're having a heart attack. Here's a sign that you may have a stroke. There's a sign that you may be diabetic. Well, I haven't even met the doctor yet, but I've already looked up at the signs and diagnosed myself. But it's not a positive thing that we want to go into. So many of the environments are starting to look at, wow, that must be pretty stressful. There's one place that I know in the emergency room where they began to divide out their interactions. And they would go out and they would provide things like children's coloring books, but also adult coloring books, because we need it just as much as they do. But just finding ways to really understand that the stressors are not just on the parents. If the parents are there to receive services, then the kids are sitting there with nothing to do. And we try to make that, and then flip the script if it's the other way around. Okay? How about peer support? Now, this is a whole talk in and of itself, but I cannot overemphasize the need and the positive outcomes that are achieved when you can develop peer support in this. Because when you're talking about people who are under the greatest degree of stress, you are talking about an opportunity now to provide someone that is at their high level, that can say, man, I can't possibly understand how you're feeling right now, but I'm here for you. I'll support you. And I know you know this already, that it could be amazing in terms of how that comes. And how you do that based on our social contacts or otherwise, you could even have peer support through video conferencing, through emails, through phone chats, through whatever you want to use the media, but connect them to someone that is more parallel to how they've been feeling. Now, here are some things that I want you to kind of take away as we kind of draw towards a close here. Encourage those opportunities. Be creative, but also listen. Now, I have 4 grandchildren. I can tell you the oldest one is 14, or I'm sorry, he's 19 now, and the youngest one is 5. And I can tell you that in that range, their collective knowledge about all of the things that are going on with IT just dwarfs, completely, overrides anything that I've ever had in my head. So now I have realized that by listening to them, I know now how to host a Zoom site. I know now how to work things out and communicate with each other. I'm still old-fashioned, folks. I mean, I still love picking up the phone, calling you and say, hey, how are you feeling? And waiting for an answer back that says, I'm okay, how are you? But there is so many more opportunities based on the need that we have right now. But also checking up on them, setting up a schedule. Now, we've done this during COVID. I know through the faith-based organizations, there was a lot of effort to say, if the sick and shut in or the elderly, connect with them. But not just to say, hey, how you doing? Hopefully things are going well for you, and hang up the phone or whatever and never communicate with them again, but set up a regular schedule. Let's talk about trust and transparency. How many of you are aware, you've heard this old statement before, that kids can smell BS a mile away? It's not just kids. But people can tell if you're not sincere. People can tell if you are just presenting your work ethic to them. So we want to be also aware of ourselves. Are we in this because we have the 15 minutes to do with this child, or are we in it because we are genuinely vested in wanting to make a difference for this child? Let's keep our communications regular. I didn't say having therapy every day for an hour. I'm really talking about just keeping the connection. And you can use as an example of faith-based components. That if you are part of a church organization that has a pastor, I think it's amazing sometimes that pastor seems to know a little bit about each person and how much of a difference that makes when they come up and say, hey, I heard you had a really big test yesterday. How did things work out for you? That may not be a great example if it didn't turn out okay, but the point being is that they understood and cared enough to want to ask about it. Now, here's some considerations. How about this? Explain why things happen. What's the why behind policies? And it may be harder to actually do than it is to say, because many of us are really unclear, since COVID is evolving every single day, how to give a direct answer for anything. But be transparent. Have the ability to say, as Benjamin Franklin has said years past, ask me any question and give me an hour and I can get you an answer. Because people will respect that quite a great deal more than to just gloss it over, minimize it, or otherwise. But come across understanding the outcome, that because you're doing all these wonderful things, because you are vested in their care, it shows your strength. It shows your sensitivity. Because during a crisis, what are we all looking for? We're looking for leadership. We're looking for someone that can make us feel like it's going to be okay. And believe me, folks, you are those individuals. But in order to convey the strength, you must also make sure you're strong. So I ask you to take care of yourselves. Ensure that your needs are covered. Don't dive in thinking I'm going to handle this well if you're not handling things at home. Get the assistance that you need. We talk about voice and choice. I love this particular slide only because it really outlines what we need to be doing. Try to give voice and choice as much as possible. I've traveled the world, and a lot of the European nations will talk quite a bit about empowering their kids. They let their kids make decisions and then come back into the global setting and share what they have come up with. And it's some of the most incredible things you ever want to see. But just allowing them, when possible, to talk about what they think. How about collaboration? Because how we do our services, we need to understand, we need to empower everyone that is in our organizations. There is no hierarchy chain here. If you're running a service where you're seeing kids, you need to understand that that doctor, that therapist, that top-notch individual should be seen in equal light as the person that comes in to do housekeeping, the person that is the dietitian, because every single one of them has connection with the kids that you're serving. And you know this already, but I'm just going to repeat it again. A lot of them will turn to those individuals and will talk to them before they talk to the therapist. Why? Because they're non-judgmental. They're nice people to talk to. We have a huge contract with the juvenile justice system in Maryland. And I get that all the time, that the kids in the juvenile justice system want to talk with the dietitian, because the dietitian asks them questions like, hey man, what are you going to do when you leave here? You ever thought about going back to school? You're a really smart kid. Why don't you go this route? And I'm not saying therapists don't do that. I'm just saying that the kids will make their choice based on how it's presented to them. The cultural responsibility, that's a whole hour's lecture in and of itself. I can guarantee you there. But we still need to understand the cultural strengths of the neighborhoods that we work with, and understand that they have their unique challenges. And the better we understand the unique challenge of the areas that we work in, the more favorable we're going to have in terms of outcome. There is no universal way to be able to work with these kids. You have to take a look at the inner workings, because that's what they're going to be looking at. Are you going to be a blanket person? Are you going to come at them with the routine things? Well, at this point, it's okay to be traumatized. It's okay. You want to talk about next steps, next moves. Yeah, we understand that part about trauma. We really are vested in, how are we going to get you to the next level? How are we going to help in the healing? How are we going to help in your recovery? Right? So the core concepts, folks, safety first. Safety first. You're not even going to get anything out of these kids if they don't feel safe. So you want to make sure your environment's safe. You want to make sure your presentation is safe. You want to make sure that you give them a feeling that talking with you is that appropriate and nice connection that gives them the comfort zone that they're searching for. I talked earlier about what happens to you versus what's wrong with you. We talked about the all behavior has meaning and purpose. I didn't put the purpose in there, but also purpose. Look at the healing as possible, because that's your goal. That's really where this thing is going. And then the organization and organic pieces of comforting, controlling, stabilizing the brain. But just the last piece kind of says what I said a little earlier, but just want to bring it up again. Everybody, ourselves included, we need meaning, we need purpose. And don't diminish that in the kids that you see. Many of them are searching for meaning and purpose. And you may be the vessel that supplies that. Now understand that may not be supplied the day you see them. But if you are fortunate enough to continue to stay on this earth, there will come a time where one of them may come back and say, you know what, you really made a difference in my life. And all we have to do is take a look at ourselves, because only in the presence of compassion will people allow themselves to actually see the truth. And with that, I thank you all for your time. I thank you for giving me this opportunity. And at this juncture, if I'm able, I'll happily entertain any questions anyone has. And thank you all.
Yeah, so thank you, Dr. Sims. Just in looking at the chat box as you were talking, so many people just, this is great, this is so good. Can we, do we get access to the slides? It's been really good, and I'm kind of stalling a little bit because there may be some questions, but there was so much. Like, I'm sitting here thinking, okay, so where do I start? But if you do have a question for Dr. Sims, you can unmute yourself. The chat box is moving pretty quickly, but if you want to put a question in there, we'll watch for those as well. But if somebody has a question for Dr. Sims, if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Even before the question, and I'm okay with this, that particular slide set, I'll be happy to, you already have it, you just have it with some additional slides. But I really don't have a problem if you want to turn that into handouts or something and okay, send them out. That would be fine. Yeah, so we will post this on the Missouri After Schools Network website. If that's okay with you, Dr. Sims? Absolutely. Okay, so we'll post it on the website, so you will have access to kind of go back. Like I said, it was lots of information.
And I have not been watching the chat box for the last few seconds, and it scrolled. Mark, I don't know if you've seen any.
I haven't seen any questions, but I've just been lots of kudos, lots of thank you, Dr. Sims, for this great information, and want to be able to be able to have access to the slides and so forth.
You know, I will say this much, folks, and this is because I've done a lot of different presentations like this. Generally, not having the questions is to me, a real honor. What it says to me is that people genuinely accepted the material, but I have to turn it around and give you guys the praise. Because I know that in a lot of webinars, there are people that are washing their cars, that are maybe watching television on another station or whatever, but the attentiveness is evident when you see that. And then there are others, I don't know if there's any other physicians on the line, but we're not so nice about that. I mean, quite often in webinars and presentations, we personally try to find a question that will stump the presenter. And it's just lovely when you don't see that come through.
I told Brad as I told Brad as you were doing the presentation, because he actually asked me, he says, boy, the chat box is awfully quiet. And I said, people are leaning in. And so it was really, really good to watch them. And people are saying it was food for their soul. So thank you again.
Good. Because again, that tool for your toolbox, I just want to, I put this last slide up there. If you want to see this, I would go into this site here. This is the SAMHSA concept for guidance for trauma and guidance for a trauma-informed approach. It's actually an old publication, folks, but it still contains a lot of really valuable material that you can use as a template. What you'll see when you open it up is that it has a lot of stuff in it that you're already doing. But sometimes we need that reminder that, okay, as we put our template in terms of how I'm going to start off tomorrow, there may be one or two of these items that you add to your current list. I'm going to try this tomorrow. Or there may have been a light that came on that says, you know, the little Johnny that I'm working with right now, I didn't know this piece here. Let me give that a try. But I'll leave you with one last thing. Talk to each other. Because what happens sometimes when we have breakout rooms or otherwise is that whatever you bring to the table as your difficulty, what's going on, there's someone that's going to say to you, wow, I had that same experience and this is what I tried. And I can be extremely helpful.
Yeah, great. All right, okay, so there's a question in the chat box.
Yes.
What are your recommendations for our young Black men in the current conditions around police brutality in America? Looking back, I mean, that's days.
Yes. There's no short answer to that. There's no short answer to that. I can't answer you with a direct answer. I can give you indirectness, because otherwise it's going to come across as personal feeling as opposed to any evidence-based backing, okay? But what I can say is what my elders said, all right? And this is me. Pray for us. Okay, and I know I'm not supposed to go down that road per se, but there isn't really a formative thing I can say, because each circumstance, despite the fact that the theme is consistent, each circumstance has its internal separateness. And all you can hope for in any of those circumstances is that justice prevails. But what I will say, based on a trauma lens, is that if your population has a number of young African-American patients or cases within your spectrum, also put that in your armamentarium, that is a good thing to talk about with them, because you will find attitudes, you will find feelings, you will find positions, where their thinking is, what they're planning on, how they view things. Because again, as I mentioned during the talk, a lot of it has to do with community trauma. When we did work in Baltimore City, and I know it's a long answer to the question, but we did work in Baltimore City just after the Freddie Gray riots. If anybody remembers that event occurring, where Freddie Gray was a young African-American gentleman who the police arrested for an offense, and on the way to the commissioner's office, he somehow died in the van. And the people demanded that the 5 officers identified, be indicted, charged, and placed under the jail. There were riots that occurred within days of that occurring, but yet the outcome was that all 5 officers were completely set free. No charges were brought against them, but yet there were no more riots. So again, part of what happened within the city was that they began to target the specific community groups to begin to say, we're here. Let's start working on this from the inside instead of waiting for a final answer to then see what the community is going to do about it. And they found that to be highly effective. So you have your own internal communities built within your clinics or your settings or wherever it is. Use that platform. If you want to have these kids get together and start their own peer group, to start talking amongst each other, that can often be helpful. And it's something where you don't want to be the overseer or the leader of the group, because you want them to be free to talk about it. That can often be helpful as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question, Simona. Any other questions for Dr. Sims? All right. Dr. Sims,
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be chewing on this information and putting it into practice, I'm sure, for months. So we're grateful that you could give us some of your time today and your expertise, and we'll carry this with us as we go back and get in front of our kids.